Wilt Chamberlain scored more points in a single game than entire teams sometimes managed. He averaged 50 points for a season, led the league in scoring 7 straight times, and dominated the record book like no player before or since. And for most of his career, he lost. Not because anyone was more talented. He lost to Bill Russell, a man who barely cared about scoring and believed the numbers everyone worshipped were hiding the truth about winning. Russell tried to explain it for years. He said championships were not built on individual statistics, but on defense, sacrifice, rebounding, passing, and making everyone around you better. He proved it with 11 championships. Still, people looked at Wilt's numbers and assumed Russell simply had the better team. Then something remarkable happened. Late in Wilt's career, desperate to win again, he stopped chasing statistics. He defended more, passed more, sacrificed more, and played closer to the philosophy Russell had preached for years. And in 1972, he won. In this video, we're going to break down what Bill Russell understood about winning, why Wilt Chamberlain spent years appearing to prove him wrong, and how Wilt's final championship may have proved Russell right all along. But to understand why, you first have to understand just how impossible it seemed that Russell could ever beat Wilt in the first place. Let us start with the two men themselves. Wilt Chamberlain was not supposed to exist. That is genuinely the simplest way to describe what he did to professional basketball when he arrived. He stood 7'1" in an era when a man that size was a carnival attraction, and he moved like a sprinter. He could have run track. He could have thrown the shot put at an Olympic level. He chose to funnel all of that into a sport that had absolutely no answer for him, and the results broke the imagination of everyone who watched. On the 2nd of March 1962, he scored 100 points in a single professional game. A real game against real professionals whose entire job that night was to stop him. 100 points. More than 60 years later, no one has come within 20 of it. That same season, he averaged 50.4 points per game across the entire schedule. Think about what that means. Not his best night, his average night. Every time he stepped on the floor for an entire year, the expectation was 50. He led the league in scoring in each of his first 7 seasons. He led the league in rebounding 11 times. He once pulled down 55 rebounds in a single game, a record that, like the 100 points, has never been threatened. He was, by the cold arithmetic of the box score, not just the best player in the league. He was arguably the best collection of numbers any team sport had ever generated. And then there was the other one. Bill Russell was 6'9", which was big, but not the kind of big that stopped conversations in a room the way Wilt did. He came out of the University of San Francisco, where he had won 2 national championships and quietly reinvented what defense could be. He arrived in Boston in the middle of the 1956 to 1957 season, joined a franchise coached by a sharp, cigar-chewing tactician named Red Auerbach, and something clicked that would not stop clicking for 13 years. Here is the number that matters for Russell. 11. 11 championships in 13 seasons. There is nothing else like it in the history of North American team sports, and there almost certainly never will be. He won 2 titles as a player and a coach at the same time, becoming the first black head coach in the history of the league while he was still the best defensive player in it. But look at his scoring, and you will see the whole argument of this video in a single statistic. Bill Russell never once averaged more than 18.9 points per game. Not once. In every single season of his career, he grabbed more rebounds than he scored points. He was, on offense, deliberately, philosophically ordinary. He left the scoring to other people, and he won more than any human being ever has. So there it was. The scorer and the winner, the numbers and the rings. And when these two men met, which they did constantly, the collision defined an entire decade of the sport. They played against each other an enormous number of times, well over 100 games across the regular season and playoffs combined. And the head-to-head tells a story that people still argue about today. In their regular season meetings, Russell held the edge. In the playoffs, where everything actually counts, Russell held a decisive edge. But the real number, the one that ends most arguments, is this. They met in the playoffs 8 times. Russell's Celtics won 7 of those 8 series. 7 out of 8. Now here is where you have to be honest, because this story only works if you are honest. When Wilt and Russell were on the floor together, Wilt was almost always the more productive individual. In their head-to-head battles, Wilt averaged around 30 points and nearly 30 rebounds a night. Russell averaged around 14 points. If you were handed those two stat lines with no names attached and asked who was better, you would pick Wilt every single time. It would not even be close. And that is exactly the trap Russell was talking about, because the man who scored fewer points, grabbed fewer rebounds, and by every individual measurement looked like the lesser player, kept walking away with the championship, over and over and over. And the reason he kept walking away with it had nothing to do with the numbers everyone was so busy admiring. And if you want to see exactly what that looked like, look at how those series actually ended. In 1962, the very year Wilt averaged that mythical 50.4 per game, his Warriors pushed Boston to a 7th game in the Eastern Division Finals. Russell smothered him that night, holding him to 22 points, while both men grabbed 22 rebounds. And with the score tied and 2 seconds left, it was Sam Jones, not any Warrior, who rose up over Wilt's outstretched arms and buried the shot that ended Philadelphia's season by a single basket. 3 years later it happened again, and somehow it was worse. Game 7, 1965, Boston clinging to a 1-point lead in the dying seconds. Wilt had 30 points and 32 rebounds and had just scored 10 straight to drag his team all the way back into it. And then, with Philadelphia holding the ball and a chance to win the whole thing, John Havlicek did the kind of invisible defensive work that never shows up in a box score. He read the inbound pass, reached into the passing lane, and stole it. Season over. Wilt's staggering line, once again, buried under a 1-point loss. That was the pattern. Not blowouts. Knife fights, decided in the final seconds by the plays that nobody ever bothered to count. So what did Bill Russell actually understand? What was the thing he kept trying to tell people that nobody wanted to hear? The clearest window into it comes from Russell himself, years later, when he was trying to explain his philosophy to a struggling group of players. He told them something that sounds, at first, like the opposite of everything you would expect from a man famous for selflessness. He told them that despite everything written about him being the most unselfish player in the game, he was in fact the most egotistical player they would ever meet. You can imagine the confusion. This was the man who left the scoring to others, who built his entire identity around defense, telling a room full of young players that his ego was enormous. And then he explained the difference. He told them that his ego was not a personal ego, it was a team ego. His ego did not demand points for himself. It did not demand records or headlines or a spot at the top of the scoring charts. It demanded one thing and one thing only: the success of his team. His personal achievement, he explained, had become his team achievement. There was no separation between the two in his mind. Winning was not something he did for the team. Winning was the only thing that fed his pride at all. That is the whole secret. That is the thing nobody in his era wanted to accept. Russell understood that basketball, unlike almost any other sport, is a game where the most valuable things a player can do often don't show up in a box score. A shot altered instead of blocked, a rebound that starts a fast break before anyone else has reacted, a defensive assignment so suffocating that the other team simply stops running their best play, a teammate made better because the giant behind him erases every mistake he makes. None of that gets counted. None of that shows up when you open the newspaper the next morning and scan the numbers. Russell built his entire game on the parts of basketball that the statistics could not see. He anchored a defense that, in his final championship season, was the best in the entire league. He turned rebounding into offense faster than anyone alive. He made ordinary players into champions simply by standing behind them. And he did it while averaging fewer points than half the starters in the league, because he genuinely did not care about scoring. Not out of some false modesty, out of a cold, clear understanding that scoring was not the lever that moved the game. And here is why nobody listened. The numbers were just too seductive. When a man scores 100 points, when he averages 50, when he shatters every record in the book, the human brain simply cannot hold the idea that he might not be the most important player on the floor. The evidence of Wilt's greatness was loud, visible, and constant. The evidence of Russell's greatness was quiet, invisible, and buried in the final score of a playoff series that people had already stopped analyzing. So the era made its choice. It looked at the two men and it decided that Wilt was the phenomenon and Russell was the lucky one, the winner with the better teammates, the good player who happened to be born into a dynasty. There was some truth in that, and we will get to it because it matters. But it missed the deeper thing entirely, and the person who understood that better than anyone, the person it quietly tormented for years, was Wilt Chamberlain himself. Because Wilt knew that is the tragedy at the center of this whole story. He was not oblivious to the argument, he was consumed by it. There is a revealing account from Jack Ramsay, a Hall of Fame coach who spent years around Wilt and knew him well. Ramsay described a player who was intensely aware of his own statistics in real time. Wilt knew during the game exactly how many points and rebounds and assists he had. He tracked them in his head as the action unfolded. Ramsay recalled a moment when Wilt actually approached the official in charge of statistics to correct him, insisting that his rebound total was wrong at halftime and then waiting to make sure the number was changed to match his own count. That is a man who cared about the numbers, deeply, personally. And Ramsay was clear about the reason it cut so deep. Wilt was annoyed, genuinely annoyed, that so many people regarded Russell more highly than him, and he knew exactly why they did. It was the winning, it was the championships, it was the one thing all of his staggering numbers had failed to deliver. So imagine the position Wilt was in. He was the greatest offensive force the sport had ever seen. He owned every record that mattered, and none of it was enough, because the smaller man in Boston kept collecting the only trophy that the public would ultimately use to judge them both. Every ring Russell won was, in a sense, a quiet argument that everything Wilt was doing might be beside the point. That is a brutal thing to live with. And it created what people around Wilt often described as an enigmatic quality, a strange push and pull between the individual dominance that came so naturally to him and the team success that seemed to require him to become something else entirely. For years, he could not resolve it. He would put up numbers no one had ever seen and go home without the title. He would dominate a series statistically and lose it. The scoreboard loved him. The standings did not. And then, slowly, painfully, he started to change. He started, without ever quite admitting it, to play the game Russell had been describing all along. The first crack came in the 1966 to 1967 season, and it came because of a coach. Wilt was in Philadelphia by then, playing for the 76ers under a coach named Alex Hannum. And Hannum did something no one had really dared to do with Wilt before. He asked him to stop scoring so much. Think about how radical that was. This was the greatest scorer in the history of the game, a man who had just years earlier averaged 50 points a night, and his coach was telling him to pass the ball more, to shoot less, to play harder on defense, to trust his teammates. He was asking the most dominant individual talent in basketball to voluntarily make himself smaller on offense for the good of the team. And Wilt, to his enormous credit, did it. His scoring average dropped to around 24 points a game, which for him was practically restraint. But everything else about his game bloomed. He posted the highest shooting percentage in the league. He grabbed the most rebounds. He finished third in the entire league in assists as a center, which was almost unheard of. He stopped trying to be the whole offense and started being the engine that made everyone else's offense run. And the 76ers became, by many measures, one of the greatest teams the league had ever seen. They tore through the regular season, and when they reached the playoffs and ran into Bill Russell's Celtics, the team that had blocked Wilt's path so many times before, something finally broke the other way. Philadelphia dismantled Boston. Wilt did not just beat Russell, he dominated the matchup, controlling the series while doing all the little things that Russell himself had spent a career preaching. And then Philadelphia finished the job in the finals, and Wilt Chamberlain was, at long last, a champion. Jack Ramsay would later call it the best season of Wilt's entire career. Not the 50-point season, not the 100-point game, this one. The season he scored the least and gave up the most and finally won. Do you see what happened there? Do you see the argument being made in real time? The moment Wilt Chamberlain played like Bill Russell, he beat Bill Russell. The moment he subordinated his individual numbers to the needs of his team, he collected the exact prize that Russell had been collecting for a decade. It was the first hard piece of evidence that Russell had been right the entire time. that the path to winning ran directly through the sacrifice of the very statistics that had made Wilt a legend. But here is the thing about a lesson learned this late, after a lifetime of being the greatest scorer alive. It does not always hold. And the very next season, the old pull came back. In the 1967 to 1968 season, Wilt took the team concept to a place that had never been seen before and has never been seen since. He decided to lead the entire league in assists. Not among centers, among everyone, every point guard, every playmaker, every player in the sport whose entire job was to pass the ball. And he did it. He finished the season with 702 assists, the only center in the history of the league ever to lead it in that category. He had one game against Detroit where he recorded 22 points, 25 rebounds, and 21 assists, the only performance of its kind the sport has ever produced. He had become the ultimate team player, a 7'1" facilitator running an offense like a giant point guard. And yet the season ended in a way that captured the whole contradiction of Wilt Chamberlain in one agonizing collapse. Philadelphia met Boston again in the playoffs, and this time the 76ers built a commanding lead in the series, going up 3-1. They were on the verge of ending Russell one more time, and then it slipped away. Boston clawed back, forced a 7th game, and in that deciding contest, something strange happened. Across the entire second half of the most important game of the season, Wilt Chamberlain did not attempt a single shot from the field. Not one. The most unstoppable scorer in the history of basketball, in the biggest game of the year, simply stopped shooting, and Philadelphia lost. When the media asked him about it afterward, his answer was almost bewildering. He explained, in effect, that his coach had not told him to shoot. That was the enigma in full. A man so gifted, so aware of the argument about his legacy, so capable of playing the winning way, and yet somehow unable to hold on to it when it mattered most. Russell's Celtics went on to win the championship again, and the debate raged on, with Wilt's critics pointing to that silent second half as proof of everything they had ever suspected. They were now heading, both of them, toward the moment that would nearly destroy their relationship for good. It came in the 1969 finals, and it is the darkest chapter in the entire rivalry. By this point, Wilt had moved to the Los Angeles Lakers, joining forces with two other all-time greats in Jerry West and Elgin Baylor. On paper, it was the most talented team in basketball. The Lakers were heavily favored, and on the other side stood an aging, worn-down Boston team that had limped into the playoffs as the 4th seed in the East. A team no one expected to even reach the finals, led by a 35-year-old Bill Russell in what everyone sensed would be his final season. The series went the full 7 games, and in that deciding Game 7, in Los Angeles, with the championship on the line, Wilt injured his knee and took himself out of the game. He would later say he asked to go back in. He would say he begged his coach, Butch Van Breda Kolff, to let him return, and that the coach refused. What is not in dispute is that Wilt Chamberlain spent the end of the biggest game of the season on the bench, and that Boston, the underdog, the aging team nobody believed in, won the title by 2 points. It was the 11th and final championship of Bill Russell's career. And then Russell said the thing that would sit between them for the next 20 years. Speaking publicly not long after, Russell tore into Wilt for coming out of that game. He said, in blunt terms, that Wilt had copped out in the final game of the series. He said that any injury short of a broken leg or a broken back was not good enough to justify sitting out a game like that. He was, in essence, accusing the greatest physical specimen in the history of the sport of quitting on the biggest stage there was. For a man like Wilt, who had spent his entire life haunted by the accusation that he could not win the way Russell could, it was the deepest possible wound delivered by the one person whose opinion he could never dismiss. Wilt stopped speaking to Russell, not for a season, for decades. Russell, for his part, would later write about the moment with a strange tenderness, describing the way Wilt left that final game as being like a misspelled word at the end of a book he had cherished. But the damage was done. The greatest rivalry in the sport had curdled into silence. And yet, buried inside that cruelty, there was one more push toward the truth. Because those words, as harsh as they were, would not leave Wilt alone. They lodged themselves somewhere deep, and 3 years later, they would drive him to close the argument forever. Which brings us to 2072, the season that settled everything. Wilt was 35 years old now, no longer the 50-point machine of his youth. The Lakers had a new coach, a demanding, meticulous man named Bill Chamberlain. And Chamberlain looked at his aging superstar center and asked him once again to give up the one thing that had always defined him. Chamberlain convinced Wilt to stop worrying about scoring almost entirely, to pour everything he had left into defense, into rebounding, into setting up his teammates, to become, in the twilight of his career, the closest thing the game had ever seen to a living version of Bill Russell. And Wilt, the man who had once corrected a statistician over a single rebound at halftime, said yes. His scoring average that season fell all the way to under 15 points a game, a number that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. But he led the entire league in rebounding. He anchored the defense. He fed the ball to guards Jerry West and Gail Goodrich and let them pour in the points while he did the invisible work. And the timing of what happened next is almost too perfect to be true. 9 games into that season, the great Elgin Baylor, a 10-time first-team selection and one of the most gifted forwards who ever lived, finally accepted that his knees were finished and walked away from the game. Chamberlain handed the captaincy to Wilt. He slid the young Jim McMillian into Baylor's forward spot, and he turned Gail Goodrich loose alongside West so that West could concentrate on running the offense. A team that had spent years built around 2 famous scorers was suddenly built around one enormous man doing the dirty work in the shadows. And the very next game after Baylor's farewell, the winning started, and it simply would not stop. And what happened next is one of the most staggering runs in the history of professional sports. The Lakers won 33 games in a row, not a franchise record, not a league record, the longest winning streak in the history of American professional team sports, in any sport, a mark that still stands untouched more than 50 years later. During that streak, they did not just win. They obliterated people, outscoring their opponents by an average of 16 points a night. They finished the regular season with 69 wins, at the time the greatest record the league had ever seen. And they did it with Wilt Chamberlain playing the least selfish basketball of his entire life. Then came the finals against the New York Knicks, and Wilt did the one thing that finally, permanently erased the ghost of 1969. In Game 4 of that series, he injured his hand, spraining or breaking his wrist, depending on which account you believe. And this time, remembering exactly what Russell had said about him 3 years earlier, he refused to sit. Wilt himself made the connection explicit. He recalled that 3 years earlier, Russell had rapped him for not coming back into the final game when he was hurt. And so, hand-throbbing, he came back. He played through it, and in the deciding Game 5, wearing a protective wrap, he put up 24 points and 29 rebounds, and led the Los Angeles Lakers to the first championship in the history of the franchise. He was named the finals' most valuable player, the greatest scorer who ever lived, won the last and most satisfying championship of his career by scoring the least he ever had, by sacrificing everything the box score once worshipped, by playing hurt when it would have been so easy to sit, and by doing all of it in service of the team. He won, in the end, exactly the way Bill Russell had always said you had to win. His teammates understood it completely. Gail Goodrich, reflecting on that championship team years later, said that everyone on that roster changed their roles to make it work, but that Wilt made more adjustments and more sacrifices to his individual statistics and his individuality than anyone else on the team. The man with the biggest numbers gave up the most. And that, finally, was why they won. Read that back and let it land. The most statistically dominant player in the history of basketball won his championships in the specific seasons when he stopped chasing statistics. In 1967, when Hannum told him to pass and defend. And in 1972, when Chamberlain told him to sacrifice everything for the team. Both times, the ring came only after the numbers went away. That is not a coincidence. That is a proof. Bill Russell had been trying to tell everyone the answer for his entire career. That winning was not about the individual dominance that filled the newspapers, that it lived in the invisible spaces, in the sacrifice, in the team ego that demanded nothing for itself except victory. The whole sporting world had looked at Wilt's incomprehensible numbers and Russell's modest ones and concluded that Wilt was the greater force. And in a sense he was. But greatness of that kind, Russell insisted, was not the same thing as winning. And the ultimate confirmation did not come from Russell at all. It came from Wilt, who could only win when he abandoned the very things that made him a phenomenon and picked up the things that had made Russell a champion. Now, in fairness, because this story demands fairness, there is a counter-argument, and it is not a weak one. Russell's Celtics were stacked. He played alongside a parade of Hall of Famers, from Bob Cousy to Sam Jones to John Havlicek, all of it orchestrated by Red Auerbach, the greatest architect the sport has ever known. Wilt, especially in his early years, often carried thinner rosters. The rings, the skeptics argue, were as much about Boston's depth as about Russell's philosophy. And that is true. A great philosophy still needs great players to execute it. But notice that this does not actually break the argument. It sharpens it. Because when Wilt finally did have the supporting cast, in Philadelphia in 1967 and in Los Angeles in 1972, he still only converted that talent into a championship in the years he chose to play the selfless way. He had enormous talent around him in 1969 too, and he lost, and the series ended with him on the bench. The supporting cast was necessary, but it was never sufficient. The missing ingredient every single time was the willingness to disappear into the team that Russell had understood from the very beginning. And here is the part of the story that redeems all of it. The two men, after all those years of silence, found their way back to each other. Time softened the wound. The competition that had once curdled into bitterness slowly revealed itself for what it had always been underneath. In 1997, when the league gathered to honor its 50 greatest players, Russell spoke about his old rival with nothing but reverence. He said that nobody seemed to appreciate what an incredible player Wilt truly was. He called him the best player of all time, a man who dominated the floor like no one else ever could, and marveled that anyone could be that big and that athletic at the same time. This was the man who had once accused him of quitting, now calling him the greatest of them all. And when Wilt Chamberlain died in 1999, at the age of 63, it was Bill Russell who spoke the words that finally revealed what the whole rivalry had really been. Russell said he felt unspeakably injured. He said he had lost a dear and exceptional friend and an important part of his own life, that their relationship had been intensely personal. He rejected the very word rivalry. He said they had never really had a rivalry at all. What they had was a fierce competition built on friendship and respect, and that the ferocity of it had bonded them as friends for eternity. He said Wilt was the greatest offensive player he had ever seen, that Wilt's talents were so superhuman that they had forced Russell to play at his own highest level, because anything less would have meant embarrassment and defeat. Think about that last part, because it completes the circle. Russell was admitting that Wilt had made him great, that without the impossible challenge of Wilt Chamberlain across the floor, there would have been no reason for Russell to become the most relentless winner the sport has ever produced. The two men were not opposites, they were two halves of the same lesson. Wilt was the ceiling of what individual talent could reach. Russell was the proof of what that talent had to become in order to actually win. And in the end, the scorer and the winner agreed. Not because Russell talked Wilt into it, but because Wilt lived it on the floor in 1967 and in 1972, when he set down the greatest numbers in the history of the game and picked up a championship instead. Bill Russell was right about Wilt Chamberlain. He was right that the numbers were a trap, right that winning demanded sacrifice, right that the team ego had to swallow the personal one before a title would ever come. He was right for more than a decade, while the entire sport insisted he was merely fortunate. And the man who finally proved him right was the one person who had every reason to want him to be wrong. Nobody listened when Russell said it. They only believed it when Wilt showed it. And by then, the two of them understood something the rest of us are still catching up to. That greatness and winning are not the same thing. That the loudest number is rarely the most important one.